The Switch has many controller attachments that have attempted to give players a more home console or pro-like experience on the go in handheld mode. Hori's split pad controllers are pretty good, but they're missing some key features like the NFC reader and, more importantly, motion controls. In comes this new peripheral that aims not to be controllers to be put on the side of the Switch, but create a unit the Switch slides into to effectively create an entirely new handheld console. Plus, it has motion controls and even claims to have gotten rid of stick drift. So let's take a look. Here is my review of the Nitro deck. Now let's start with hardware. This thing is kind of like a shell. It's a full-size unit with physical buttons all over it and a large hole in the middle that the Switch slides into, whether we are talking a Generation 1, V2, or OLED. Around the rest is essentially everything else the Switch needs to run. We've got all of the inputs from the joysticks and face buttons to a screenshot and home button. On the top, we've got some pretty sizable shoulder buttons and triggers, arguably even larger than the ones you'll find on home console controllers. It's also worth noting that the joysticks of the Nitro deck can be removed and replaced, with some extra ones being sent with a new unit. Then we've got the back, which has a lot going on as well. First of all, we have 4 programmable buttons. There's also a physical button back here allowing you to turn the home button's LCD light down or off, a little white clip to release the Switch, a large kickstand, and almost hidden right up at the top are 2 USB-C ports. One is for charging and the other for using this as a controller while your Switch is docked. Now let's talk about the main 2 parts of this, where the Switch goes and that kickstand. The front of this device has a huge area the Switch slides into. When inserted, the Switch will slip down into the USB-C port and lock itself in place. You have to pull the tab on the back to be able to remove it, which really gives you the feeling of this being an entirely new handheld console instead of a shell that the Switch could fall out of. For the sake of size comparison, this is just a little bit smaller than the Steam Deck. Now the kickstand I emphasize just because of how good it is. It's pretty thin, but customizable at different angles, kind of like an improved version of the OLED model's wide kickstand. It's thin, but it's incredibly stable. This means you can leave this out and will never have to worry about your fingers hitting it while you play, letting you just set the unit down when you need to do something else and not have to reopen that kickstand. Next, let's talk about functionality. The Nitro deck gets its power from the Switch itself and will register as a USB controller. As such, you'll have to go into settings first and enable Pro Controller wired communication to use it. This is pretty nice, but there is a downside. The peripheral is recognized as a USB controller and not handheld mode, meaning handheld mode specific games are not compatible with it. The list of these games is very small, but as an example, you cannot play Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee with this peripheral without Joy-Cons to connect wirelessly. It's also worth noting that by using a USB connection through the output port on the back, you can dock your Switch and use the Nitro deck as an actual USB controller. You will have to hold the analogs down for a few seconds after plugging in the cable to use it like this, but it works pretty well. Now this thing looks great, but let's talk about performance. I noticed right away that there was an adjustment phase. With the buttons much larger and further apart, my thumb wanted to rest a bit to the left of the right analog stick and not right on it. Thankfully, I'd completely adjusted to this around the 3rd day I used it. And there's nothing really I can complain about with how it handles. The unit is light, buttons are extremely responsive, and it feels good to use. As far as the no stick drift claim goes, I haven't had any in the 1 to 2 weeks I've been using it, but I think that will be more months and years down the road before we'll get a solid answer. If there is one complaint I have about this, it's that the LED light on the front of the deck resets pretty much every time the Switch is turned on. It's extremely bright and I will often turn the light off. Then when I turn the Switch on again, even just moments later, that maximum brightness light will be back once again. Now past hardware and performance, one last thing to talk about is battery life. Obviously this thing uses the Switch to power itself, so it's dragging power out of the Switch to use it as a controller. How does that affect battery life in games? I tested this on my Switch OLED with Pokemon Violet and it does take a little chunk out of the battery. With the Joy-Cons and the game on max brightness in airplane mode, Pokemon Violet gets around 4 hours and 30 minutes of battery life, while with the Nitro deck it gets about 4 hours and 10 minutes. That's roughly an 8% drop in overall battery life. This won't be a huge issue with the V2 and OLED models, but it might be more substantial of a drop if you use a 2017 original Switch. Now let's wrap this up. The Nitro deck brings the Switch a large peripheral that'll turn it into a much larger and more professional feeling handheld console. Now, the downside, it does drain a bit of battery life away, and the LED light resets every time the Switch is turned on. But if you use a V2 or OLED model, this is a fantastic accessory that finally brings us home console level of feel from the controller and the NFC and motion features the Hori split pad controllers are still missing. Reviews to Go rates the Nitro deck an 8.5 out of 10. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.